Hello and good afternoon and welcome to this week's episode of Data Matters, brought to you by Privacy Culture. I'm Steve Wright, partner at Privacy Culture, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's event. We're talking about, can a CISO be a DPO, or vice versa, can a DPO be a CISO? Now this is, I have to say, a matter close to my heart, as I have actually performed dual roles. Yet when I go around and I talk to my DPO friends and CPO friends and I speak to my CISO friends, they give me that kind of strange look and sort of, really? Did you? How did you manage that? So today's event is addressing that very subject. And today I'm delighted to welcome two very special guests. We've got Helen Rabe, who's from ABCAM. She's the CISO, and I'll come back to that in a sec. And then in the left corner, we've got Duncan Smith, who's a DPO from iCompli. And both come with very rich experience in both realms. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask a few questions, normal format, but ultimately this is much about your show as it is our show. And so Nathan, our producer, is there in the background ready to take those questions that you may have or clarification points or anything like that. And always, of course, we record the show and we post it up on our website, so feel free to come back later and have a look at that. So without further ado, let me just introduce Duncan. Duncan is develops and trains and has a rich experience in this space on the Institute of Data and Marketing, and also the Chartered Institute of Marketing and the Governance Institute. So in other words, he does a lot of training, a lot of lectures around this whole, what is a DPO, what's the role of a DPO, and compliance, etc. And a very rich experience. So welcome today. I'm really glad to have you, Duncan.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
On the other side, in the other corner, is the wonderful Helen. Helen, as if you don't already know, has actually been a guest on our show in the past, and she has worked for as a CISO for CBRE, Costa, but sort of started her career in banking for UBS and JP Morgan. So has really grown up in that whole security risk space. And both of these people come at this subject with their own sort of experience and thoughts on that. So what I'll do is I'll just give you a little bit of sort of contextualizing for this, and then hand it over to our wonderful guest. So we all know that GDPR lawfully requires, under Articles 37 to 39 and 69, 71, and in the DPA 2018, that independent data protection officer with the professional qualities and experience, and this is featured in the text as well, in various other organisations such as the European Data Protection Board have produced some guidelines, and there's quite a lot of this, and they're all stating that the DPO shall report to the highest level of management of the controller and processor, and that, in other words, as a DPO, you should be able to escalate in an independent way up to that. And what it also does is it sort of stipulates that it can't really have any conflict of interest. Now, in particular, there were two cases which we know of, one in Germany and one in the Belgium case more recently, which was the one where the Belgium Data Protection Authority fined an organisation, it was a telecoms organisation, because the gentleman who took the role on also had responsibility for compliance, audit, risk management. And they said, well, look, that can't be, that can't happen. And unfortunately, that gentleman was let go. And actually, interestingly, so was the chief marketing officer as well. That's not so well known. And they were fined only €50,000, but nonetheless, this was a really big impact on them because it was just in the middle of a merger. They were being taken over, and it would have affected their share price and would have impacted them hugely. So that sort of gives you a little bit of a feel of what's happening out there. Now, being that I'm a technology guy and a data guy, I've grown up where you have to be realistic. You have to double hat. You have to sometimes try to be all things to all people, and you can't just say, no, that's data protection, go and talk to data protection about that, or that's infosec, go and talk, or that's cybersecurity. No, you have to be able to talk and understand, and understanding when you're in a role about being able to converse and know what you're talking about. Now, that doesn't necessarily constitute expert or experience, and certainly from an independence perspective. So I'm going to ask the question first to Helen, and then I'll go over to Duncan straight away. So the first question is this right? Has GDPR got it wrong? Can both roles coexist or be one person perhaps? Or could it be shared? I mean, especially if it's like in a smaller organization. What's your thoughts, Helen?
So, hi everybody. Steve, thank you very much again for the opportunity, for letting me be here. Let me try and answer that succinctly. First of all, I can't tell whether GDPR is right or wrong. I don't have the power. And you know what? My experience of it has been that so far it's been helpful, that more helpful than not. With regards to this hybridization of the DPO-CISO role, and this is my subjective opinion, by the way, and this is not ABCAM, so I just need to be clear on this, please. Do I believe it can work? It's contextual. There is no one size fits all, right? I have found in my experience recently that companies that haven't traditionally had a very strong regulatory overhead, private sector companies, the smaller ones in particular, are still acclimating to GDPR and the notion of that rigor, as well as the notion of the oversight that rigor provides and what it means they have to do to adhere to that. So many of them are still trying to apply that. Let's bundle this role together, because you know what, we're small. We don't need a separate DPO when we've got a CISO or a head of security. It puts you in a bit of a bind, because you've got to then go back to your C-suite, who are normally the ones driving that kind of decision, and say, right, we have a challenge here. I mean, recently the Belgian precedent has helped this narrative. Yeah. And you say to them, there are segregation of duty issues here. And they go, Helen, we're a small company. Come on, surely you can do this. A small company is irrelevant in this. It's the matter of the law here. And I am not a data privacy expert. Yes, privacy is becoming more and more a part of the CISO's remit. Absolutely, the two are not mutually exclusive. In the past, maybe so, but I don't see them as such. So you've got to find ways around this. You've got to be able to tell a story to whoever's driving that decision, that it's not as clear cut as you're a small company, therefore you can amalgamate the role and get away with it. There are laws and precedent now that are going to mean that this is more difficult. So do I think that it can be? Right now, I'm going to say it's dependent on the maturity of your organization, the size of your organization, and I think we'll lead into this later. There are ways around that if you have very limited choices. Yeah. My preference is, personally, as a CISO or head of security, is I like to have a standalone DPO. I like bouncing these notions off each other. I like the fact that there is an expert, and this is a qualified expert, right? I've done my CISM, I've done all those things, but I still don't think that makes me an expert. But this is legal detail, and I don't have the time at this stage of the game to go and learn all of this stuff. So that's my thoughts on the matter.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks ever so much. That was really good. Thank you. Lovely introduction to your thoughts there, Helen. So Duncan, I suppose, any sort of builds on that, anything you want to say in relation to that?
Yeah, I'm not going to jump in with both feet. In answer to the question, can they be conflated? Can you have a DPO-CISO? The answer is no. You can't. Legally and technically, if you look at the law that we've enacted and you look at the case law that we have, the answer is no. But we've got to. What is the purpose of GDPR? So whenever I get one of these problems with clients, we just try and break it down into the smaller chunks that you can kind of work out. Go back to first principles. And if you go back to first principles on this stuff, you head all the way back to your human rights. What is the point of GDPR? We're trying to look after people, little people that we have in jam jars, that we shake around in our organizations. How do we look after those people? Well, we've got to make sure that the law is upheld. So if there is an opportunity for a conflict of interest, we've introduced risk into the organization, and we've introduced the potential for harm. And that's what we're supposed to not do. If we abide by the principles of GDPR, we're supposed to protect people from harm. So if we conflate those two roles, there's the opportunity to hurt people, because at the end of the day, when there's a conflict of interest, people will take decisions that we don't expect them to take. We don't know why they took them, but that opportunity is there. So we can't do it. But as Helen said, the problem is, this is the real world. We actually have to do something. And particularly in smaller companies, I don't think it comes down actually to whether there's a conflict of interest. I think the more important element that we're going to discuss later is this thing about your knowledge. And the idea, as Helen said, to be able to bounce ideas backwards and forwards. So I think we do CISOs and DPOs quite a disservice when we say, oh, you couldn't possibly do that role because look at the conflict of interest. Actually, there's a lot of really decent people out there that are just trying to do their job and comply with the legislation. I get that if they're massively being blackmailed for something, there might be a conflict of interest. And I get the fiduciary thing later on, where there's a higher level of risk, if you like. But I think for small companies, I think you can conflate the two, but it's not legal to do so. And that's the problem we're trying to address.
Brilliant. Thank you. I can see that in this week's episode that I'm going to have to play the bad guy. Because I have been the CISO and a DPO, and I think it was okay for a period of time if you could separate out those functions, and that's what we did at John Lewis. So I think where the challenge is definitely in the smaller organizations. Now, okay, we're in a pandemic, and a lot of, unfortunately, small organizations won't survive, but there's somewhere in the region about 5.6 million SMEs in the UK alone, of which 90% of them are under 10 people. So I'm just saying, I have a business. When I have a problem, right, I don't, like I've had a problem with technology yesterday, I said, right, that's it, I'm going to sack my IT manager. But that's me. So, is there a limit to where this grows and grows? The level of those responsibilities, or the maturity, as you said, or the risk and the harm to individuals. That isn't my question, actually. I'm just playing devil's advocate here a little bit. Sorry, Helen, did you?
No. So Duncan raised his hand there, and I don't know where he's going to go with it. So I'm going to give him the opportunity to speak first. But you go. It's the threshold, right?
It was the threat. So it's exactly that threshold question, which is we got to be really careful to make sure that we don't confuse small company with small risk. And that's a big, and I think it says it in GDPR, or maybe in the EDPB guidelines somewhere, that actually we should be looking at volume and sensitivity of data. So we could have three of us, the three of us here today, we could be running a company that has billions of data points that we're managing for organizations, and that could be a massive risk. We could be managing sensitive databases and stuff. So what we've got to do is we've got to look at the data that we process, and then ask the question, should we conflate or not conflate these roles? And I think if there's a very high risk, then we need to stick by the law and have a third-party DPO bought in under a service contract.
Well, here's a question, Steve. Do you know how big Cambridge Analytics was?
Well, yes, it's a good point. It's a very good point. It was under 30 people, I think.
Right. So there's that, and to Duncan's point, I think that really brings it home for us is the nature of the data. I mean, one of the challenges I have as well in immature organizations is they think the DPO is responsible for all the data, not just the GDPR specific. The lack of understanding around the DPO role also means that they seem to have they've blown the DPO scope completely out of proportion. And the DPO in this context, as I understand it and see it, is predominantly about the GDPR, right? Whereas a lot of people I'm hearing are just bigging up that role to include data, critical data assets, legal, HR, etc. that falls
Helen,
under.
sorry to jump in there. I've got a question on the back of that, because, you know, as a CISO, you know, for some massive organizations, you've had huge responsibilities. And you've made your point quite clear, and it's very sound. What then should the function of the DPO report to the CISO? That's a question that I get asked a lot. You know, we're you know, you could argue it's two sides of the same coin. You know, the CISO is looking after the, you know, the security, the confidentiality, and the sort of integrity and availability, and, you know, and likewise on the DPO side. So, you know, there's a lot of crossover here between, you know, we've both got a duty of care, you know. So should the DPO report to the CISO, or the CISO report to the DPO?
Absolutely horrid question to ask me off script. But, and what an inflammatory question. So personally, no, I do not want a DPO reporting into me. If I'm a traditional CISO, I'm sitting in the second line function. I can't even, and sometimes I don't even own the first line, but there's an oversight into first. And then the DPO is sitting in our traditional third line, and there's that oversight into me, right, which is necessary. Do I think the DPO? No, I do not want the DPO reporting into me. Again, I think that makes the conflict of interest area even more messy rather than unraveling it. So no.
Thank you. And there was a slight echo there on your, just to emphasize your no. Yeah, that was perfect. What do you think then? Come on, Duncan. Yeah. You know, let's hear it. You must be working with small organizations, and you're telling me that you're going in there and you're saying, oh no, you need another hire. You need to put another person on your budget. Come on, be real. Be real. We're in a pandemic, man. Come on.
Yeah, it's not going to happen. Let's face it, it's very much like Schrems 2 and Privacy Shield. You know, we're talking to a lot of people about that. You know, there we've got some case law. Case law has said you can't transfer your data across to the US. And what are a lot of people doing? Investing in legal advice? No, because there isn't the money to do that. There isn't the money to hire the external or a new DPO. So we are running ragged in a lot of organizations. But when I say running ragged, it doesn't necessarily mean running roughshod over the legislation. So what we're finding is actually people are pulling an extra shift, whether it be a CISO, well, particularly a CISO, I think, are pulling an extra shift to try and learn all about the data privacy laws. And just take something as simple as one of my areas, which is marketing. All right, so we've got a bunch of web dev people that are putting tracking technology on websites so that we can build custom audiences for Facebook and Google Sandbox. Right now, if I've got a CISO sitting next to me, she's probably, or Helen, you know, you're gonna be sitting there going, what's that? Yeah, it's look, it's Google Sandbox. We're looking at Turtle Dove at the moment because we're not sure how we can do tracking cookies, but we've got this massive audience that we can market to. That is bang in the DPO's remit for a privacy impact assessment. You got to sit down and look at that and go, is it okay to track the location of all these users on their apps so we can market to them? Now, the CISO should be working with the app developers, hardening the app, but then the CISO will go, you know, I've just sat down with the app developer and they said, oh, it's really cool. We can use the accelerometer in the phone to work out whether people are happy or sad. Let's do that. So the DPO role has to come in and fit and mesh in with the CISO role. I, for one, would be scared out of my mind if somebody said to me, should we be using 128 or 256 AES encryption on this endpoint lockdown, hard down? Yes. I wouldn't have a clue. So maybe we're missing the point. Well, not we're missing the point. GDPR misses the point that in smaller companies, we need pockets of expert knowledge. And maybe it's this reporting up to the most senior level that's muddying the waters. That's the bit that's confusing everybody.
I agree with that, because there is no organizational model is the same. I mean, private sector companies, retail, wow, retail's like the Wild West. When you come from a financial services background where everything is regulated and it's in hierarchies and it's all, you know, it's a thing of beauty sometimes, although cumbersome. And then you go to retail and you realize without that regulation, they've not had to adhere to that. So it's hard and it's loose. So I agree. I think that going back to your original point, GDPR being wrong, nothing so binary, but there is now nuance that GDPR needs to accommodate. Now that it's been practically applied, and we're living it and breathing it, we're starting to see that there are some constraints around it's. I know it was set up by lawyers, but you can see that now we need a little bit more flex to start. And I think Duncan's point is spot on. We need more flex.
I think one of the points where we have to watch out for flex as well is where we've got publicly traded companies and we have other responsibilities, fiduciary roles and those kind of things. There is legally a higher expectation in terms of that segregation of duties. You know, if you have that fiduciary function, then what is it? It's you can't make money from it, and you mustn't have a conflict of interest, I think, is the basic principle in law, right? So if you're that person, if you're the auditor, if you're the one that is charged with looking after somebody else's interest, and in GDPR, DPO, we're talking about the data subject here. If you're charged with looking after the data subject outside of that company, then yeah, you do have to have that special role. So I think when we say you can conflate in small companies, there are other examples where clearly you cannot. In John Lewis, for example, or you're not going to conflate those roles because it conflicts with your other corporate companies' law requirements as well.
Yeah. Okay. No, this is brilliant, and thank you, because you've both given very strong arguments as to why there needs to be this separation. And I think your point, Duncan, was spot on. That we are double hatting. Lots of small organisations. Guess what? I'm also the FD. It's incredibly hard. You've got to be thinking laterally, and you've got to be thinking vertically as well at the same time. And there is a conflict. So what advice would either of you give if there was a situation where that couldn't be possible, or perhaps even in the early stages when it's not black and white, the level of processing or the sensitivity of data that you're processing? Take, for example, a startup, and limited budgets, they're bootstrapping or whatever. What advice would you give them around the conflict of interest or sort of segregation points that you mentioned? Helen, do you want to have a stab at that first?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand, and I think where you're coming from. So for me, and I know cost is something. So if you've got a lawyer who's acting as your DPO, and you have a head of security or your CISO, right, and you are a mid-size, I'm going to go mid-size company. The way I've seen it work, and I use that term work loosely here, is, the lawyer doesn't want to take on the DPO accountability. You're left with little recourse other than to take the hybridization, and the CISO is going to take on that accountability. The lawyer is still going to be there to support you on subject matter expertise in the law state, but they're not your DPO. The title now sits with the CISO. Your CISO then goes and seeks external counsel from the likes of you, Steve, or Duncan, and goes, look, this is my challenge, right? I don't want to be the Belgian individual. I need to do my due diligence here. I need you to clearly tell me where these conflicts of interest exist. Here's my situation, here's my setup, here's my global makeup of my business and my organization, here are my data points. Help me understand where GDPR will find conflicts of interest in my business, in my organization. Look at those conflicts of interest and see if each one of them, if they can be mitigated. If they can be mitigated internally, great. If they can't, I'm sorry to say, folks, you're going to have to spend money and you're going to have to seek an external third party. So, and that means a DPO as a service type things that we've talked about in the past, right? Yeah. That has been the only way I've seen people mitigate those conflict of interest areas, showing the due diligence, showing the decision making behind why they took that path, and then relying on that external position as and when it's needed. So you've basically taken every step along the way that you can within the law of GDPR to mitigate the conflict of interest areas. And still work internally with your legal counsel and still keep your cost overheads down to as best as you can. That's nice.
Yeah. Duncan, do you want to add to that around the sort of Chinese walls and
Yeah, there's not much that I wouldn't agree with there or disagree with. Sorry, the budget thing is a really important. When you're bootstrapping a company, there's a pot of money that you've got, and there are also those job role things as well. So you tend to have, the VP of sales, the president of this, the CIO, because actually when you're bootstrapping and marketing something, you need that on someone's business card in order to be able to give the business some kind of gravitas. Having a DPO doesn't really kind of do it, unless your business is all about data. And this is something that is actually that is definitely changing for the good now, which is if your business is all about data and you're a small tech startup company, people are asking questions now. I'd love to use your product, but I can't use your product or service until I'm really sure that you've got your head screwed on about GDPR and privacy rules. So actually, those bootstrap companies now, some of the budget is going to leak over from sales and marketing into risk and compliance. And the smart founder or co-founders will actually shift some of that budget across to GRC if the product they are selling is a data product. Because what you got to do is you got to sit down and flip a few stones over, right? You got to flip a stone over that says, what's common sense here? Okay, so you got to do the common sense thing. Then you got to do the legal thing. What does the law say? So you flip GDPR over and you go, oh, crikey, we have to have that. Then you got to check, what has the regulator behavior been like in your operating territory, right? So if you're in the UK, has the regulator gone for anybody on a DPO yet? There was a freedom of information request, interestingly, from another gentleman that I'm aware of. I'll talk to you guys about that one later, maybe. But that FOI request came back and said, no, we're not telling you whether we've decided to take any DPOs to task on this. So our regulator is playing this one very tight to the chest at the moment. So looking at all of those things, you would then bleed some budget left or right from sales and marketing across to compliance and go, the territory we operate in is litigious, and as a consequence of which, let's get a DPO.
Helen?
Quick one that I've seen to that point on the marketing and the startups and bootstraps. Chief Data Officer is something that is starting to rear its head. And I have known 2 instances where the CDO has taken on the DPO under that function. So you've got high-end business intelligence, big data, data analytics, all of that under the Chief Data Officer, and somehow they're wrapping the DPO under that as well. So they're not separating out their data just from a GDPR's perspective. They're just saying the DPO will fit within the CDO function and they're part of our data strategy. I have seen 2 instances of that recently. And
interestingly, it's one of the questions that has come through from our audience to that point, and it says, thank you, Espen. I'm a CISO with the DPO role. I'm trained in personal data matters and certified in addition. The CISO role has overall risk and auditing responsibility and not direct security responsibility. So it's an important thing to specify. So I'm responsible for managing compliance for both security and privacy and bringing matters to the C-suite to address the responsibility to avoid conflict of interest. So any thoughts on that, panel?
That sounds like a clear split between first and second line. So this would be the second line, governance only. And there's no operational security aligned with that. And that's how they've done that. So that's my view on that. I have that, but I still find I can't extricate myself completely from the first line because the nature of my organization, it just prohibits it. But if it's that neat and you can tie it up in a bow, that's great. Duncan?
Yeah, so it sounds like the common sense approach, doesn't it? Where, as like I said, people are double heading. What they're doing is they're getting themselves trained up, so they meet those requirements for subject matter expertise. They meet the requirement for the CISO role, but we still have the conflict of interest issue, and it is impossible to get rid of that conflict of interest issue. If you, what is the EDP guidelines? It's if you're responsible for the determining purpose and means. That's the basic issue in there, isn't it? So you can't audit yourself on that basis. So if you're looking after information security and you're wearing a DPO hat and you discover that there's a flaw in your information security, do you fall on your own sword? So whilst people can have the subject matter expertise, that pure division that's required in order to be able to ensure that there is always no conflict of interest, we lose that. And I don't necessarily think that's such a bad thing. Like I said, I think it's worse to not have a CISO DPO than to be going, well, we can't have one because we don't have this direct route to the senior management.
And you know, David Appleyard, who I've known a long time, has made that point very nicely. Thank you, David. Are we missing something here? In the majority of cases, startups, do they really need a DPO? You know, it's a good point. I mean, I've got a question about, you know, the whole role of an external DPO, and it's a few of the questions are coming through around this, because that's got to be an option, right? You know, especially if you're a small organization and you are processing large quantities. Cambridge Analytica, sensitive personal data, Cambridge Analytica. You know, under the Working Party, Article 29 Working Party, and in the EDPB guidelines, it says that a DPO, the exercise or the function of a DPO can be exercised on the basis of a service contract. So, yet some of the questions that are coming through, and clearly that's an option. You know, we provide DPO as a service. So can this work? And if so, if you outsource it, the questions that are coming through is, how can that be truly sort of impartial when you're giving advice to your clients?
Yep.
And then you're being the DPO. So over to you, Duncan. Do you want to try and tackle that one first?
Yeah, sure. It has the same conflict of interest issues. Okay, so an external DPO is under contract to provide services, and as a consequence of which there is economic pressure to ensure that you retain the contract. So if you turn around and go directly to the regulator, which is your responsibility as a DPO to even bypass the board. So you bypass the company directory, go straight to the regulator and say, there's a company that hired me as a DPO and I'd just like to dob them in, thanks very much. You can see the obvious conflict of interest there as well. But that being said, it's always this least worst solution that we're looking for, which is, there's a problem clearly with the contract, but isn't it not better to have at least somebody who's a subject matter expertise that is there helping you out? So you could, in the contract, make it clear that you would obviously have direct route to the regulator, and you wouldn't be contacting the board in the event of a breach, etc. But it's unlikely to happen. The other thing about an external DPO, though, and this is always true of consultancy, is you could be internal information security CISO DPO and nobody will listen to you. But if you're an external resource, you can come in and say change your password every 90 days and everybody will. So there's some benefit from external. But...
So I see. So you're pulling out the advantages of the independence and the fact that, you know, you're being a trusted advisor, and sometimes that's very useful. No, great points. And I mean, the thing here is, interestingly, some of the questions that have come through to a point you mentioned earlier, Helen, about the role of the chief data officer. Now, I know of a well-known credit card company whose chief privacy officer moved into a chief data officer role. Now, clearly, she had to give up her privacy responsibilities, but you know, you could argue, who knows, you know, if you know the law around what you can't do with the data, then you're going to be in a strong position. But again, there's a conflict there, isn't there? So Helen, any further thoughts on that conflict of interest between a CDO and even the CIO? To some extent, and really what I'm thinking about is that, you know, because it's very clear about you cannot determine the purposes of processing, which is the big no-no. What the Belgian case was.
I think what we're all hearing here, Steve, is that if you get to the point where you're self-regulating, you're going to have conflicts of interest, right? We just can't move away from it. And to Duncan's point, it's finding the lesser evil in this. There is no black and white. Well, the law is black and white in this, from what I can tell, what Duncan read out to us earlier. I don't think we can move away from the conflict of interest. So are we driven through this rigor, through GDPR, to have a split DPO CISO. And honestly, the lesser evil for me has to be that piece where I just mitigate the conflict of interest areas that are pretty tenuous, right? Those that I know that there's going to be no wiggle room with the regulator. And you just, I honestly, I don't see us getting away from it. I'm sorry, I can offer nothing in the way of a prescriptive response here for the audience that says, you know, here you go, guys, here's the magic formula, here, run away with it. It's that conflict of interest is going to keep rearing its head if you blend this role. Okay, right. So you're just going to have the split. And if you can't afford the split, identify your conflict of interest areas, work with your legal team, and find the best way possible to mitigate those conflict of interest areas.
No, brilliant. Thank you. And you know, that sort of you've absolutely summarized it quite nicely there. I think the you know, my job here is to be provocative, so I shall continue. Is you know, being a CISO, head of security, CISO, you've grown up with looking at the threats and the vulnerabilities associated with data. You understand how those, you know, those issues can be exploited. Surely you're better placed to be a DPO. Surely you should be going on a training course and train yourself and then just rebadge yourself as DPO. Is that not the case, Helen? Or... It's
not my career path personally. I can certainly go on to the IAPP and do the certifications. That doesn't make me competent. I've seen many people with certifications who are incompetent. So that aside, I don't see that as a panacea. You know, just because I then become the subject matter expert in both privacy and security, and you just start to break me, because it's not like a CISO or head of security's job is low pressure. Yes, we're well placed, but at the same time, we also need perspective, right? If we try and be all things to all people, we will break, first of all, I think, right? If you're fortunate to have that clear breakdown where you're second line governance and that's all you do, wonderful. But in smaller companies, we tend to wear double hats on most things anyway. I get involved in the DevSecOps, you know, world, etc., and the first line operational, and it's not perfect. Nothing is perfect. So yes, we have visibility of the threats, but I have the beauty of having my DPO and a strong symbiotic relationship with her, where I can immediately go, you know, that software that you've cached and you know, from our website holds all of our customer data. Have you by any chance done a DPIA on where you're going with this? What's that? So you get on, you speak to the DPO and you go, you're going to really need to dip your toe in the water with this. It also takes some of the pressure off the workload that you and your teams have. Okay, Duncan.
Yeah, no, I was gonna hit Steve back between the eyes with something along the lines of, so is it okay to use consent as the lawful basis for processing in the HR department? We've got an issue coming up at the moment where somebody with a disability has just said, boom, right, CISO, you're out, okay, DPO, you're in. So this is the real thing. It's GDPR is just a massively complex bit of legislation, and what we really should be looking for is subject matter experts and building teams of subject matter experts. And the problem is the law is against us on this one. It's trying to stop us doing what is actually common blinding sense, which is to have people that know their stuff. But which is what they say in DPIAs. Actually, if you go back to the DPIA thing, you know, about building stakeholders and getting all the stakeholders in or whatever it says, that's exactly what we should be doing. And it's this goddamn conflict of interest thing, which is taking away the fact that people with just enormous brains the size of planets when it comes to information security, or whether or not we can monitor COVID temperatures using a remote camera of staff walking in through the door, you know, there's huge issues for DPOs and CISOs. But there's one point I would like to make in defense of the CISO being much more involved or in the DPO role, is just look at the monetary penalties and the fines that we're getting now. So if you think about breaches in GDPR and do a quick assessment of where is the risk, the big data fines are with data loss, which is usually through an information security issue. So is it really important that HR doesn't use consent as a legal basis for processing, but uses legitimate interest? Yeah. Is it more important that we harden our organization to stop a data breach? And I think probably the latter is more important.
Well, and that's part of your risk profile, and that's where your DPO needs to be part of your risk governance as well. Okay, because you can't make these independent, arbitrary decisions without consultation. Privacy and security, they're not mutually exclusive anymore. So
yeah. Okay. So I mean, wonderful debate as suspected, and it's been a delight to have you here today on our show. So thank you once again for as we kind of start to wrap up now. I was interested to know. You know, we've dealt with quite a few of the sort of conflict of interest, and actually you've really come up with some fantastic points. You've talked about, you know, depending on obviously the processing, you know, what type of data and the quantity, but you've talked about the maturity, you've talked about the size of the organization, you've talked about the risks, you've talked about knowledge, and being a subject matter expert, and trying to balance it, I think was what you were saying, Duncan, you know, rather than running roughshod, was your words, over those data protection laws, which is a really good thing. We've talked a little bit about governance, and how that can play a big role in, you know, data governance, and how that can really help in terms of those roles and responsibilities. I suppose, what do you think, you know, for an organization perhaps that is a bit bigger and does have regional presence or different in-market presence, say different parts of the world like China or anywhere in Southeast Asia or in Americas? What do you think are the attributes then that these champions or these people, and how do you segregate them from that conflict of interest? Because they could be HR people, they could be marketing people. I'll give that one to Helen first, and then come back to Duncan. And this is, I promise, this is the last question, because we've really got to go, and my producer will get upset with me.
So very quickly, China treats it as a unique law unto itself. Okay, don't. You, first of all, honestly, I don't think you'll ever be compliant. You can try, but I don't think you'll ever be compliant in China. My guidance on China is this: do a risk assessment, figure out every variable when it comes to data. So do a risk assessment with a company that specializes in China. Make sure you get to a position of knowns around your business in China, and in particular the way in which you manage your data. I believe last week they released a new data regulation, an addendum, which almost looks like a cut and paste of GDPR. It's very good in China, but make sure that you just get to a position of known. So China treat us as an entity in and of itself, and get that as right as you possibly can. The rest of the world, if you have the luxury of a DPO, then their skill set needs to extend into those regions, and you need local on-site support. So, you know, we have it in AppCamp. We have local regulatory support as well, should I say legal support from a data standpoint, and you need that, all right? So from my side, I would say you need local on-site support. Mostly people you can extend to legal houses, legal firms, but if you have a core DPO, that's where the benefit comes in from that. But China, law unto itself, tread lightly, get your notes. Duncan.
Yeah, okay, that's good advice on China, definitely. And I'm just going to broaden it out to Steve's original question as well, which is like rest of world. A good DPO, again, or a good CISO will have knowledge of global privacy law. So, you know, you need to know your Australian privacy principles, or your Japanese law, or your whatever it is. So you need to be aware of those. But the good news is when you dig into them, is GDPR did a good job of setting the sort of the bar, if you like. So in most cases, if you comply with GDPR, you will be close to other legislation. One of the big problems that we've got just across the water in North America is getting people to recognize the differences between the two regimes, and particularly for the marketing teams. You know, it's the opting-ins and the opting-outs, what you can't do with data. So my advice for anybody that's trying to put a DPO role in a global organization is The DPO individual needs to be somebody who is a real orator, is someone that can chat and talk. And it's somebody who has a skill set that is completely away from GDPR, which is the ability to actually build teams, just join people together. If you're the frosty head of legal that doesn't necessarily work well with everybody, oh God, I'm stereotyping them now. No, if you're that kind of individual, you're probably not going to be able to build those teams fast enough. So having somebody that is respected from their knowledge perspective, but also is just a great people person, they're the ones that will be able to get. They're the ones that head up the data ethics kind of groups now. So in bigger companies, we're seeing a lot more. We're seeing, aggregations of people called data ethics, and that's everybody. That person, the person that joins all those people together, is a good person for a global DPO as well.
Wonderful. Well, what a superb ending, and thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Helen. Two fantastic viewpoints. We've really uncovered this one. We can see it's not easy for some organisations, and there's been some real nuggets of great advice in all of that. Now, as we wrap up, next week we have brought to you, next week's show is all about privacy in the connected world, Internet of Things, my connected fridge, my Hive, thermostat on the wall telling me when I'm hot and when I'm cold. Well, it doesn't quite do that yet, but it soon will be. And all of those amazing privacy challenges. And for next week, we have three fantastic guests. We've got Simon Langley from a very large insurance company called Kavia. We've got Jen Stirrup from Data Relish, and we've got Glenn Meyer from Save the Children, all coming next week to talk about privacy and IoT and privacy in the Internet of Things, essentially. Some of those debates around track and trace and some of the points that we touched on today about sort of taking people's temperatures and things like that. Where is all this information being collected and stored? So we're going to try and unpick that next week's show. Once again, a big thanks to Helen and Duncan, and to all the audience for tuning in. We have hundreds of you, and your comments and your feedback is really, really encouraging, and thank you so much. So we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you to Nathan, our producer, and I'm Steve Wright signing off. Thanks again. We look forward to seeing you same time, same place. Tune in.